Thank you for joining us for the Budgeting and Staffing for the New Year webinar. My name is Jackie Yarkowski, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation. Throughout Kansas and Nebraska, the foundations help Methodist churches, ministries, and individuals be good stewards of the resources they have been entrusted. And we're here to help you as a church. We're here to help you as an individual, better plan for your future. We do that through, from legacy giving and investment services to church grant opportunities, leadership development. Our focus truly is to help your church grow and your ministry to flourish. I will now turn it over to Dustin Petz, who serves as president of the Kansas Methodist Foundation.
Thank you, Jackie. Welcome, everybody. Let us join together in a time of prayer as we begin. Gracious God, we ask and pray for your blessing to be upon us as leaders and the congregations and ministries that we get to be a part of. Help us to be good stewards of what you've entrusted to us. Help us to be faithful with our work and our effort to prepare and plan well so that we can have growing and impactful ministries, making disciples and transforming the world around us. We pray for the staffs that we're a part of. We pray for our process of discerning how to prepare the resources and be good stewards of what we've been entrusted to make a difference in this coming year and future years. Pour out your Spirit upon us as we learn. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The Kansas Methodist Foundation and the Nebraska United Methodist Foundation are excited to host today's presentation as part of our Leadership Development Ministry. We are grateful for the opportunity to have, again, Dr. Lovett Weems and Dr. Ann Michel from the Lewis Center for Church Leadership to share with us new perspectives and practices for a healthy church dialogue related to budgeting and staffing. Dr. Lovett Weems is a distinguished professor of church leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary and senior consultant for Wesley's Lewis Center for Church Leadership. Dr. Ann Michel has served on the staff of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership since 2005. She teaches also at Wesley Theological Seminary in the areas of stewardship and leadership. Dr. Weems and Dr. Michel are authors of the new book, Generosity, Stewardship, and Abundance, a transformational guide to church finances. Lovett, Ann, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much to all of you for being part of this and for the invitation to join you once again for these webinars. We're dealing with budgeting and staffing today. We will spend the first half on budgeting. I'm going to begin with a few comments about budgeting, and then we're going to take a block of time for discussion. And then Ann's going to share some ways to communicate the budget once we have that ready. So we began with some techniques and perspectives for planning your budget. Let's think about, as you think about developing your operating budget for the new year, that the purpose of that budget is to cover the annual operating expenses. The goal is to ensure that the mission is fulfilled in the coming year with vitality and sustainability. What that means is that you want to make sure that you're fulfilling the mission of your church to the best extent you can, given the resources you anticipate having. And you want to do it in a way that's sustainable, that you're not making decisions in this year that somehow will make the church vulnerable or undercut of the ministry in years going forward. And the defining characteristic of the operating budget is it covers expenses incurred during the year with recurring and predictable income. Now, let's look at some budget building models. One is that you begin with a blank slate. Some people call this zero-based budgeting. It's where you say, okay, if we were starting from scratch, what would we do? Well, it's seldom used. It's not very effective, quite frankly. The second way is to begin with last year's budget. And that's very common in smaller churches. You just take that budget and you start writing in some new figures based on what you know. The next is to begin with budget request. And that's typically used in mid-size or larger churches where you ask different ministry groups to submit proposals for their expenses for the next year. Another way that's not often used is you begin with income projections. Instead of beginning with the expenses, you project, this is how much we think we're going to have, and then the leadership pulls around trying to say, how best do we use that? And then the next way is you begin with program plans. This is rarely used also. This is where you would start and say, let's do our visioning for next year and let's lay out what God's calling us to do. And then you come back and you put costs with those. But as we'll see in the next slide, rarely is one model alone. As I went over those models, I'm sure there's one of those that is closest to what you're familiar with, but usually you have to draw from others, and there's this dynamic interplay that goes on. Now we're going to look at a slide that shows how you fund that operating budget. Think of those arrows as different streams of income available to meet the expenses you've laid out in your operating budget. There was a time when there would only have been one arrow in most churches, tithes and offerings. But today, most churches have different streams of income. It could be that there's some fees that are paid during the year, maybe wedding fees, or maybe people pay an amount and use your fellowship hall for a birthday party or something. Or there may be rental income where you rent a parking lot or rent some space you're not using. It could be that memorial gifts in your church go to the operating fund, or as some churches have an endowment that provides some income. Sometimes there are bazaars or fundraising appeals. And so you'd see, what are those streams? But the key words are those at the bottom of the slide: recurring and predictable income. You don't want to base your operations, things that are spent and used in 1 year, on income that's not recurring and not predictable. An example of that would be a bequest. You receive $10,000, a member has left you in their will. That's not recurring income. It's certainly not predictable income. There are many good ways to use that. You could put it in your capital or building fund. That's something that has a life longer than 1 year. You maybe have an endowment, or you set it up with the foundation. You could add it to that. So there are ways to use that. Operating budget is not one. Also, you want to avoid, maybe you have some surplus from past years or reserve fund. I hope you do have some kind of reserve fund. That is, using those to plug a deficit year after year is not a sustainable model. You eventually run out of that money. It is appropriate to use that kind of income if it's a real emergency. For instance, the pandemic would be an example, or if a major employer in your community closes down, or a recession, or your largest donor dies in the middle of the year or something. There could be a number of reasons to use it, but not just to plug deficits or to close gaps in there. Okay, next slide. Keep in mind that the best predictor of the future is the recent past when it comes to money. So the things that you'll want to be looking at as you think about that budget is your recent financial history. And this is especially important now because the pandemic, skewed patterns. So you need to know, what are those patterns? How have they shifted, and what shifts are going to be permanent? People who have died or left, that's going to be permanent. Maybe some people have just dropped out. But also the expense side may have changed because of the pandemic. There were some things you discovered, we really didn't need that. But there are other things you've discovered, we really need more of that. Recent pledging history. Now, many churches use pledges. Don't be surprised if there may be fewer people pledging today. Some say that some are more reluctant to pledge than in the past, but you at least want to know what's coming from that and what difference that makes in the total income you get for the year. Certainly don't ignore those who give who don't pledge and act as if that's not in the equation. Income projections, I've mentioned some of those, like if you have user fees or something, you may not know exactly how many weddings are going to be or something, but you can look at the last 3 years and get a pretty good idea of what would be safe to put in there. And then review and increase income sources. Are there some income sources that with some effort, those could be increased? Or are there some new income sources that you might achieve? Now, let's turn to some questions as we get ready for the discussion time. Here are some challenges that typically come up in budgeting. What's your timeline? When do you begin? When do you end? What are the logical steps? What to do before the process begins? What information needs to be collected? What trends from the last few years do you need to look at? What does everyone need to be aware of? What budgeting method are we going to use? Do we begin with projected income or do we begin with projected expenses? How do budgeting and pledging relate? And what if in our planning, the income and expense don't match? What do we do? How do we work with that? So now let's turn to a time of discussion. When we finish this discussion time, Ann's going to share a bit about how using a narrative budget instead of a line item budget might help you present the budget once it's approved more effectively. But what are the questions and challenges that are on your mind right now?
All right, so as Lovett said, I think there's a critical question in how we can communicate most effectively about our budget. And, in many churches, the pattern is to simply provide the line item budget to the congregation, either, as he said, as a bulletin insert, or I know a lot of churches who, once they've set their budget at the end of the year, they'll then send out a copy of that line item budget with their pledge appeal. But the problem, there are a number of different problems with that. One is that a line item budget is rarely an effective way to motivate giving. The vast majority of people in your congregation, when they see a line item budget, either their eyes are just going to glaze over because they don't really understand it, or they're not interested in paying that much attention to detail, or as Lovett said, it may kind of provoke nitpicky kind of questions and unnecessary scrutiny. You always want to have transparency You don't want to conceal your line item budget from people. But there are only going to be a few people who are really interested in that level of detail. Most people want to have a general sense of how the church is spending its resources. And people tend to give not to budget lines, not to numbers. They give to support people, programs, and missions. So we want to learn how to communicate your budget in a way that conveys to the congregation what the budget is really about in terms of supporting mission. You know, another problem with sharing a line item budget is when people see a line item budget, what normally is going to jump out at them is that the church spends so much money on building and staff, right? And we're gonna get into staffing a little bit later this morning, but what you're going to be hearing is that churches are typically spending between 45 and 50% of their budget on staff. Typically, a church may be spending another 30 to 35% of their budget on their building. And a lot of people will look at that and say, well, my goodness, the church is really only spending, 8 or 10% of the budget on mission. And I want to give my money where it's going to make a difference. And if this church is only spending 10% of its budget on mission, that just doesn't seem right to me. Well, in fact, 100% of your budget supports your mission. And so a way to make that more obvious to people is by moving to what's called a narrative, or sometimes called a ministry impact or a visual impact budget. So what is that? So what a narrative budget does is it converts your line item budget into a more inspiring and attractive document that communicates all your expenditures in terms of ministry goals rather than accounting categories. So if your church's main mission priorities are, as in the example on this slide, fellowship, education, mission, and worship, you would present your budget expenditures in terms of those broad categories. So here's another example, how your gifts become grace. And basically what a narrative budget does is divide up the general expenses in the budget, especially personnel expenses, and allocates them across your major budget priorities so that people get a sense of the missional purposes behind those expenditures. And then it provides information to explain what each of those priorities are. And that's what you see on the right side of the screen is the narrative part of it, where it explains, how money that's being spent on outreach or learning or caring is impacting people. So this is a much more attractive thing for people if they're receiving a pledge letter, perhaps, than just getting a line item budget. But it's also one that really underscores the mission of the church, because people give to mission, they don't give to line items or numbers or budgets. And so some of you may already be familiar with this. This isn't a new concept. This idea has been around for a while. And my guess is that some of you already are doing something like this. If you're not, if this is new to you, this may seem like, oh my goodness, how could I do this? But in fact, it's relatively easy to do. And there are also some really wonderful resources available to help people figure out how to do this and do it effectively. So I want to share kind of a step-by-step of how somebody can begin the process of creating a narrative budget. And so the first step would be to select those major mission categories that represent your church's activities and your budget. And so you probably want to stay to about 4 to 6 so that it is, clear and simple for people to understand. And so, in my church, we talk about our mission in terms of praising and learning and serving and caring and sharing. In your church, it may be worship and music and fellowship and outreach. But whatever you feel the main mission and programmatic emphases of your church are, you start by defining those categories. Then you write a compelling description of why those things are important. What is it your church is doing in each of those areas of ministry, and why is it important to support it? It doesn't need to be long, a couple sentences, but just communicating why it's important. And then what you do is you take your line item budget, and every expenditure that the church makes, you decide what percentage of it goes in support of each one of these categories that you've decided on. So for example, with salaries, right? Someone's going to look at your line item budget and say, oh my goodness, this church is just spending 50% of the money on salaries. Well, every one of the people working in your church is supporting the church's missional priorities. So you would take, for example, the pastor's salary. And you would say, the pastor's spending 50% of his or her time supporting worship. They're spending, 30% of their time supporting congregational care. They're spending 20% of their time on, teaching and learning. And then you would allocate the cost of the pastor's salaries and benefits into each of those categories. And then once you have spread you've designated the expenses of the church across those categories, and you have totals for each of the areas of ministry, you then create a pie chart and you put it together into an attractive form. So how can you do that? I mean, some churches will do it by creating a booklet or so a piece of campaign literature if they're doing a commitment campaign. Some will just put it on a flyer that could go into the worship bulletin. It might be a PowerPoint presentation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a printed document. So there are different ways that you can present this once you've had it, once you've established it. So the great thing is, all you have to do is go to the World Wide Web. And if you search for narrative church budget, you will find lots of examples and lots of resources. So one good place to look for examples and resources is the Center for Faith and Giving. They have a very good portion on their website with narrative budgets. They have some good examples of how churches have put together their narrative budgets. They also have a video that kind of walks you through how to do it. I just noticed the other day that I think Discipleship Ministries has an online, a short online program available to help people create a narrative budget. And then we have some resources as well on the website of the Lewis Center. There's an article that we have that walks you through in a little bit more detail than what I presented this morning, sort of a simple process for creating a narrative budget, and some other articles and resources as well. So, if there's somebody in your church that has some basic Excel skills, that's generally how people go from these, put these numbers together and produce the pie charts. And there's lots of information out there that can help you figure out how to do it if it's something you've never done before. So I'd encourage you to give it a try. But the main point is to remember that a budget's always about mission. And regardless of how we're communicating about it, we need to help people understand how the budget relates to mission. And this is one of many possible ways I think that you can do that.
The second topic of staffing. And what we're going to begin with in staffing is just sharing some research that the Lewis Center's done on what proportion of budgets churches tend to spend on their personnel. And these are averages, and averages are just that. They represent a range. But Here you see the average for 2019 of United Methodist churches of various sizes. So churches of 1,000 or more attendance spent on average 43% on personnel. That's all the clergy, all the lay staff, all the salaries, and all the benefits. You'll notice that it goes up as a percentage, and the highest percentage is found in churches with 51 to 100 in worship attendance. And then it begins to go down. And so the churches that really have to spend the most on personnel are those between 26 attendance and 100 in attendance. Those on the opposite end from the large, 25 or fewer in attendance, that percentage goes down. And what we think is going on there is at that point, the fixed cost of facilities means that there is a limited amount of money left. And most churches of this size are served by part-time or shared pastors or perhaps lay supplies. Now, we're still the 25 or fewer churches. That's over 10,000 churches. So we're talking about a lot of churches there. But you'll see that the personnel spending varies by size of congregation. So the larger churches, they're spending more in nominal dollars, but they have enough resources that it represents a smaller portion of their pool. And then on the next slide, we show how that personnel spending is divided between clergy and lay staff. So for the largest churches, 74% of their personnel spending goes toward non-clergy staff. And so this is a chart where size is everything, obviously. By the time you get to the smallest, 88% of personnel spending is on clergy and 12% on lay. Now, the spending percentages over the last 20 years have been moving toward every size church is spending a little more of its personnel money on lay staff than it did before. But the main variation is by size of church. So this is just some background as Ann leads us into our discussion of staffing, and then with questions coming afterward.
Yeah. So adding to what Lovett has said about what staffing patterns look like overall in terms of the amount of expenditures and how expenditures are allocated between clergy and lay people, there also seem to be some shifts going on in the typical pattern of staffing. And this information isn't probably quite as specific as what Lovett has provided, which is based on numerical data. This really comes from the work of some major consultants who work with congregations on their staffing issues. But I think that what they have to say kind of rings true to me. And so I wanted to share it with you to kind of give you a sense of what changes might be going on in where churches perceive that they need staff. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see what I've marked as traditional staff roles that may be waning. And I say maybe because this is kind of anecdotal, but I think as we talk about it, it may make sense to you. So in the second half of the 20th century, a lot of churches followed a pretty typical staff model. And so you would have roles like church secretary, right? So when I first went, I spent 10 years in church staff ministry before I joined the staff of the Lewis Center. And when I joined that staff, we had not one, but several secretaries, and they spent their day doing things like recording the church's membership information on an index card file, and answering the phone and typing the pastor's sermons. And those are all things that people don't really have to spend time on so much anymore, because most of those tasks have become automated, and in becoming automated have become more decentralized. So a friend of mine who went to work for a large church, when they got there, they said to him, here's your laptop, this is your secretary, go and do ministry, right? And so there's the kind of work that happens in a church office in terms of clerical work is very different than it was a decade or two ago. Another role that seems to be changing is the role of business manager. And the main reason that this is changing is in part also due to computerization and automation, but also outsourcing. It's very easy now for any kind of organization to enroll in some kind of online payroll service, for example, that's simple and economical to do. So some of the functions that a bookkeeper or a church business manager may do, again, become automated or outsourced. Christian education and youth directors. In the second half of the 20th century, these were the baby boom years. Churches were full of families, large families with lots of children. This was the era in which everybody built big education wings, and they had age-level Sunday school classes every Sunday. And not only are there fewer children and youth in churches today, but there also seems to be a change underway in faith formation, to faith formation happening in ways that's less classroom based. And so the traditional things that a director of Christian education or even a youth director may have done in the past is happening in different ways now, and sort of a new paradigm is emerging. It's not really clear exactly how that's going to be, but a lot of the work that a Christian education director might have done in the past is different. And then with associate pastors, some of that is the case as well, but also there are fewer and fewer churches that can afford two clergy salaries. And so we don't see as many associate pastors as there used to be before. Now, this isn't true in every church, but this rings true to me in terms of what makes sense and what I think I'm seeing in some of the churches that I'm familiar with. What might be some of the newer roles that are becoming more important? So with, all ministry is about communication. And I think effective churches are really appreciating that, and they're having to put more resources into what it means to communicate effectively, especially what it means to communicate effectively in a digital age. So it's not just that they may need help with communication, but they may need help from people who know how to manage electronic communication. And so that often is a staff need now that churches are confronted with. Worship leadership. As churches have moved to more contemporary worship styles, they may need someone who's a worship leader as opposed to a choir master or an organist, or the paradigm of choral singing seems to be diminishing in churches, but in its place would be someone perhaps who leads the congregation in singing or worship. And then finally, and I think this will ring true to everyone, in this digital age, a lot of congregations, particularly during the pandemic, found that they needed more people to help them with electronic communication. And so they probably were just scrambling in the early days of the pandemic to do what they needed to get online and support online worship. But now that that has become a more regular feature of church life, I know a lot of churches who have felt that they've needed to add some staff resources to support electronic worship, digital worship, and other media needs. So, this is just kind of a thumbnail sketch. It may not be what's happening in your church, but it does kind of ring true to me. And then I also wanted to talk about some of the ways that a church can know if they're overstaffed, essentially, right? Because there are, it's pretty easy, I think, for churches to end up with more staff than they need. Because, a lot of times a need will arise and they think that the way to solve the problem is to hire a staff person. And they often don't really, think it through very well. And then all of a sudden they've got staff and they don't quite know what to do with them, or they've got more staff than they can afford. So I wanted to suggest some questions that you can ask to think about whether a particular staff position is really needed or whether you're overstaffed in general. And the first really key question with any staff position, whether you're adding a new staff position or whether you're thinking about whether a current staff position is still needed, is, can a volunteer reasonably do the job, right? And so when churches first think about hiring staff, it's because a job has become either too large or too specialized to expect that a volunteer could reasonably do it. And this is going to vary a lot depending on church size. In a very small church, it could be totally reasonable to expect that a volunteer would handle things like bookkeeping or childcare or mowing the lawn or whatever. But as a church gets bigger, it's no longer reasonable to expect that a volunteer could handle all those jobs. And that's when a church will start to think about hiring staff. And so that's the first key question. Another key question with any particular staff position is, are the goals and outcomes clearly understood? And sadly, a lot of churches hire people because they've got a problem area of ministry. Let's say they're struggling with youth ministry. And they decide, well, we really need to hire a person to focus on youth ministry. And they think the answer to their problem is going to be to bring somebody on board in a staff position. But the problem is just hiring somebody without, clear direction about what that person is supposed to do and what the vision for youth ministry is. That can end up being very unproductive. It can be unsatisfying for the staff person and not fruitful for the congregation. And so, if you have staff positions where people aren't clear about what they're supposed to be doing and what their outcomes are supposed to be, that's probably an area where you need to take a look as to whether those staff are really needed or whether they might need to be redirected in some way. Another question is, does the level of staffing contribute to what I'm calling the activity trap? And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But what often happens in churches, particularly maybe if it's a church that's getting a little bit older, or maybe there aren't as many people or volunteers around as there used to be, they feel like they need to hire staff just to keep everything going. Okay, maybe they have a Sunday school and they're having a harder time getting volunteers. They're having a harder time getting volunteers to work in the nursery. So they say, well, let's hire people to do that. But there's kind of a paradoxical flaw in that thinking, because when you hire new staff in certain roles, their job basically is to create more activities. And, you may find all of a sudden that they're creating more activities and you need more volunteers than ever. And you have a proliferation of marginal programs that are struggling to succeed. And unless you're adding new people, just adding new staff that are going to just try to keep programs going that you really don't have enough people to support anymore, it can just sort of increase the level of burnout and frustration. And so this is really a risk in declining membership churches that are just trying to maintain their level of programming, even if it doesn't fit their level of attendance anymore. And the answer to this problem really is right-sizing your ministry, not just hiring more people to keep all these activities going if you don't have enough people to support them. The fourth question is, are your staff spending too much time with one another? Okay. As a church staff grows, there's a tendency for staff to spend more and more time coordinating with one another and less time interacting with church and community. And that can lead to an inward focus. And so if you find that your staff is spending all their time in staff meetings and in the conference room and coordinating with one another and not really engaging the church membership and the community, it may be that your staff has grown either too large or you need to figure out other ways of coordinating your staff. The fifth question, and this is a really important one, I probably should have put it higher on the list, is does the particular staff position equip and engage new people? Bill Eastham says this is the #1 standard for evaluating the effectiveness of staff, because a lot of churches sort of fall into the trap of hiring staff to do ministry for people rather than to do ministry with people. And you want to have staff that are building capacity in terms of engaging new people, engaging volunteers. If your staff is just doing the ministry on behalf of the congregation, that's a poor sign, and you want to think about whether you can find a way to reorient that. And then the final question would be, are your staff salaries crowding out other budgetary needs? And this relates back very much to what Lovett was sharing in terms of the benchmarks of what percentage of a church's overall budget is going towards staffing. But churches can easily end up with too much staff, especially because it's very hard for churches to let people go. And so if they end up spending too much of their budget on staff, there are probably other things that they need to be spending money on that they're not, like, say, deferring maintenance, or maybe getting behind with their apportionments or other very important payments. And so that would be another sign that you need to be thinking about what your overall staffing level is. So with that, I want to move us into discussion. But before I take the slides down, I just wanted to pose these two overall questions, and then maybe you'll have some more specific questions. But the two questions I kind of wanted to put to the group is, what are the trends that you're seeing in your setting? And then what questions and challenges with regard to your staff level are most pressing currently?